Today is Tuesday, February 15th, 2000, and it's my pleasure to be with Roger Henderson, former Dean of the University of Arizona College of Law from 1977 to 1983. I am Vicki Bren-Fleischer, and I'm here to ask you a couple questions, Professor Henderson. Tell us why you wanted to be dean at this law school.
Why does anyone want to be dean anywhere? That's a good question. I don't know. I'd started my full-time teaching career at Nebraska. I was on the list of potential dean candidates there, and once you get on that list, and particularly if you make the final cut, that list tends to circulate throughout the country. So thereafter, when people are looking for deans, one of the first things they'll do is call up a school that just hired one and say, give us your list. So I was sort of in the market, and I was interviewing several schools, and this one came along. I happened to know some of the alumni, Jim Bush for one, and Doug Keddy, who at that time was a Superior Court judge out in Yuma. I don't know, it just, you look at schools and there's just something about them, and you think, gee, I kind of like these people here, and I like the school. It was certainly not because it didn't have any problems, because it had a lot of problems. But among the schools that I was looking at, I just kind of liked it. I grew up in South Texas, so the Hispanic influence, where I went to school and everything, I liked that. So they're just an area of the country that I just sort of liked, and I liked the people at the school, and I liked a lot of the people in the bar that I met. So.
And you never left.
That's true. I never left.
Okay, so let's go back to when you arrived. How was the school in terms of assets when you arrived?
Not too flush. But you have to put that in perspective. The university was not too flush either. At that time, Arizona was still a relatively unpopulated state compared to some. The tax base was not all that large. It was still a state that was highly dependent upon the so-called 3 C's, cotton, copper, what was it, citrus. It certainly had, tourists were some, but really the state's fortunes rose and fell with the copper industry. And at that time, the United States copper companies were having some hard times because countries like Chile and some of the other foreign producers were being subsidized, and these American companies were competing in an international market, and it was tough for them to make money, and when they weren't making money, they didn't have any compulsions about shutting down the mines, which is not good for anybody, the workers obviously, or anybody else. And so the state revenues, really, as far as taxes and those sorts of things, were much impacted by the copper industry. Also, the universities, the 3 universities, when viewed by people up in the legislature, took a disproportionate amount of the state resources, because we were the biggest operations in the state, NAU, ASU, and the University of Arizona. So put it, in perspective, there wasn't a lot of money to be passed around. I mean, there were good years and bad years, but it was, when the copper industry was doing well, then the legislature tended to be more forthcoming. They were never really generous. But the university had not really had a period of growth, I suppose, since World War II, the end of World War II. A lot of the buildings were certainly becoming inadequate, and that was clearly the case with the Law College building. Although it was a relatively new building, one that was built in the 60s, it was inadequate essentially when they moved into it. The story I was told is that they were asked the legislature for $1.5 million to build a new building. This was back when Charles Ayers was dean, and the legislature essentially gave them half of that. And they built the building on half, and it showed it. I mean, Tom Chandler, one of our former regents, a prominent lawyer, used to refer to it as a cream station. It looked like an old building where the farmers used to bring their milk and cream to market because of this loading platform out in back. But it was just, it was turned out to be very inadequate, overused. Another region, Earl Carroll, came in there one day and said, yeah, this place looks like a bus station in Gila Bend. And it was overutilized. I mean, there was just too many people in this facility to maintain it and keep it up.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of assets, and we had about 19 faculty members and 4 secretaries spread among those. We had no placement operation other than one of those secretaries who would take phone calls from lawyers who wanted to come down here and interview people. We had a very small administrative staff. Joe Livermore had essentially eliminated the 2 dean, associate, and assistant dean positions. He had 2 assistants to the dean. The entire staff, aside from the library, we probably didn't have more than 10 or 12 people to operate the school. And that included admissions, financial aid, and everything else that we tried to do. So it was not unusual, I would say, across the country. Law schools had been pretty much operated on the cheap. They were sort of a combination of undergraduate and graduate operations in the sense that we had large per faculty student, ratios. Universities were frankly making money off of the law schools because they were the biggest expense was the salaries for the faculty in the library. I mean, compare that to chemistry department, physics department, where you have to invest a lot in laboratories, equipment, that sorts of things. So, in short, we were not very well off. In fact, we were under a show cause order from the American Association of Law Schools and the ABA as to why we shouldn't be disaccredited because of the inadequate physical facilities.
Okay. So other than assets, were there any other problems?
Well, every school, sort of like the Army, there's always, you got to have something to gripe about. But the school was in a period of transition from a group of people who were hired after World War II when all the veterans came back, and most law schools were just skeletal operations during the war if they weren't closed down entirely, and a number of schools just closed. But the University of Arizona College of Law continued to have, of course, a very small student body and very few faculty. But after the war, with the influx of veterans, they had to gear up overnight. And John Lyons was the dean, became dean, I think, in 1947. Prior to him, McCormick was the dean. But they were practice-oriented people. They really didn't look, nationally to hire people. They were very fortunate in being able to hire some extremely competent lawyers. But these were primarily people that came out of practice who had had a number of years' experience. As those people who were, not young people at the time, many of them had been in World War II. Willard Van Slyke, for example, had been in the Air Force, Army Air Force. Bob Clark had been in the Marines before the war, but he got TB and he was discharged. In fact, he was happened to be one of the students who went through the college during the war. But in any event, that group of faculty, as the college, progressed, began to age, and then when Charles Ayers came in, he set out to, in fact, renew the place, hire young people, many of whom had only had a couple of years of practice. And I think it's only natural that eventually you're going to get some tension between those two groups, and it certainly surfaced during Charles's era. I suppose none of us like change too much unless we can see some direct benefit. And the old guard was, satisfied in the way that the school had been operated, but they terribly misjudged Charles if they thought he was coming back to preside over the status quo. So anyway, Joe Livermore had to deal with that, and I inherited some of the remnants of that problem, but I was fortunate in that a number of those people were at retirement, close to retirement age, one of the things that I looked at when I came here, and it was of great interest to me, is how many vacancies would I have, say, during the next 5 years? What opportunity would I have to hire people and renew the faculty? So, without going into all the gory details, and some of it got pretty petty and vicious, but we survived.
What was your vision for the law school when you arrived?
Well, I've always been sort of a pragmatist, and there's many things that, I remembered about my legal education. I had spent 2 years at Harvard between practice and full-time teaching before I went into full-time teaching in Nebraska, so I got to see at least how 2 law schools operated, the University of Texas, where I went to school, and Harvard. Both of those are excellent law schools. So I had some things in mind that, I thought that, gee, I would have benefited had we had these things when I was in law school. But I also am practical enough to know that you can't do everything that you might want to do. So you better have a whole list of things that you would like to do, and you have to be an opportunist. And I've told Tony and I've told Joel Seligman this, because the administration may be selling something one day, and that may not be your highest priority, but by golly, you better jump on the bandwagon and get that while you can, and then hopefully you can do the other things. So there were a number of things that I wanted to do. I certainly wanted to enhance the stature of the school nationally. Chuck Ayers and Joe Livermore had made some very constructive steps in that regard with the people they've hired. I also wanted to have a good relationship with the state bar. It was still a small state population-wise. The bar was primarily our graduates, because ASU hadn't been in existence that long. It only was created in the mid to, about 1966 or somewhere in there. So most of our graduates were the judges and held all the positions in the state bar, the presidency of the state bar, and all those sorts of things. And I wanted a good relationship with them. But I also just wanted to provide the best legal education we could for the students. And there's various ways to do that, but there are many things that needed to be done. I mean, there's always some need. There's no law school that's perfect. So there are a lot of things I set out to do, and some I could accomplish fairly easily, like taking a secretarial position and making that into a placement director. That was one thing which I thought would help us greatly, was to be able to not just sit back and be passive and have people come to us, but have someone out there essentially recruiting recruiters. And they did. And it was a very short time. We had anywhere from 65 to 100 law firms and other organizations that were interested in hiring lawyers coming here. And these were not just from Arizona. They were from California, Washington, D.C., and from other places. And that's great, exposure. Even if they don't hire anybody, they come, they look at the students, and they go, this is a going concern. So, I don't know, I'm just kind of rambling on here, but there are, many things that, we want to try to do, but you have to be an opportunist and do those that you can.
Mm-hmm. Acknowledging that you have to be an opportunist, if things had worked out exactly as you wanted, what would have been your top 3 priorities when you were coming in?
The top 3 priorities. Well, one of the things that I wanted to do was to develop outside support for the law school, because it was fairly clear to me that, at least at that time, we were never going to get the kind of funding from the state that would make this law school one of the top 25 in the country. And of course, that's sort of, a magic number, top 10, top 20, top 25. But if you're talking about the top 25 law schools in the country, half or more of those are probably private schools. And have such endowments. Harvard, for example. Michigan is not really a state law school because it has a lot of endowments. The University of Virginia. So if you look at schools like Minnesota and Texas and Illinois and North Carolina, some of the really good state law schools, the only way you're going to get there is through private giving. And when I arrived here, you won't believe this, but annual giving, I think the previous year was like $15,000. That was total. Now, it wasn't as if people weren't trying, and that's no indictment of my predecessors. We did not have a lot of graduates, for example. Harvard's grinding out, approximately 500 graduates a year and have been for a long time. University of Texas was, by that time, well over 1,000 total, which means it's 350 in an entering class. We were, up until shortly after World War II, I think it was only like maybe late 1940s, early 1950s that the school got up to a size of about 450, which was 150 in entering class. So we didn't have hundreds of lawyers out there, and many of those lawyers had stayed in Arizona. And at that time, lawyers didn't make a whole lot of money. It was like the medical profession at one time, and those that did typically did not make it practicing law. They made it in business and investments and things of that nature. It was just a different era. That has changed, but I set out to try to, first of all, gain the confidence of our alums and friends. I think we had about 121 people in the Law College Association, which is our alumni association. I just looked these figures up. It's not that I could have remembered them if I had, but I just was curious. In a period of about 3 or 4 years, we were well over 600 and approaching 700. I didn't ask people for a lot of money. I just wanted to get them used to supporting the school, just whatever you would give us. And we solicited relatively small contributions just to get people back and interested in the school and to build, sort of a base there. I figured that every once in a while somebody who had the good fortune to make a lot of money would respond if they felt good about the school, and that has in fact happened. Some people inherited money. Some people made a lot of money in, certain types of practice, but typically they made it in business ventures and other types of things, that not per se just the daily grinded out practice of law. So that was one thing that I clearly wanted to do. I wanted to hire as good a faculty as we could. I wanted to enhance the curriculum. One of the things that I wanted to do, sort of a particular thing I wanted to do, since I had done trial work, and there was no trial practice course at the University of Texas Law School, and I didn't think the one at Harvard was one that the type we needed. I wanted somebody who had a lot of hands-on experience to come in and take over our trial practice program, develop materials, and then we could use adjuncts, experienced lawyers from downtown. But you had to have a program. You had to have a set of materials. And Tom Malway was the person we hired to do that. And it took several years for him to develop those materials and us to sort of make the transition from people who came up here from downtown and did it their own way, and some of them did a great job and others not so great. They told a lot of war stories and things like that. I'm sure the students were entertained and enjoyed it, but I wanted somebody to teach trial skills, what you did in the courtroom, and I think we've got an exceptional trial practice program. So that's just one example of trying to, do something about the curriculum. And another thing that I wanted to do was emphasize research and scholarship, because that old group of faculty who were older practicing lawyers were just not of that ilk. I mean, it was not because they weren't competent lawyers, it weren't because they were smart people. Just something, that you have to start doing early in your career, and that is doing research and writing, and that's something I wanted to emphasize, and I was going to reward people for doing that. And frankly, those older members of the faculty, when it came up time for them to get close to retirement, I really tried to encourage them to go ahead and retire. And at that time there was an age limit, 70, and you might make some exceptions within the university for that, but I never argued, except in one case, for an exception to that, because they had had their career and they had done well. and it was time to bring in new people. And some of those people sort of, in a not too friendly way, used to kind of kid me about the fact that I made them retire. Well, in a way I did, but I had something good in mind, and I wanted to hire young people who would bring this school into the national ranks in terms of reputation, and continue what Chuck and Joe had started, and I think we did that. We lost some of those people. Other universities had hired them away. One person went back into sort of industry. But by and large, we have been on I think, a progression over the last 20 some odd years since I've been here, and the school has become very strong academically. I mean, these people, we have some of the outstanding people in the country here on this faculty, and they are known for that. So, since they're known, the school is known, and that all redounds to the benefit because then students want to come here, and we get better students. Alumni want to support us because we've got a great operation here, so it all fits together. So if those are three goals, I don't know that I had that clear a vision, but that was my sense of some of the things that I wanted to try to do.
Can you tell us what were some of the high points for you while you were dean?
Well, I always enjoyed my relationship with the practicing bar. It's one of the things I regret now that I'm no longer dean. As time's gone by, I seem to get out of the building less frequently in downtown. But it was it's a different time here. Most of the members of the bar were our graduates, so it was very easy to know these people. When I came here, there were 3 lawyers on the Board of Regents. All 3 of them are our graduates. And then we continued to have 2 or 3 lawyers on the Board of Regents for a number of years thereafter. And these very prominent lawyers, and I saw these people quite frequently. I encouraged people to go to the state bar meeting. I had more in-state travel money than I could use because at that time the state government felt like if anybody went out of state, it was some sort of a lark or boondoggle. It wouldn't give you any money to travel out of state. Matter of fact, people won't believe me when I say this, but out-of-state travel had to be approved in the governor's office. And it was a big coup for the university finally to convince, at the time it was Governor Babbitt, who I'm sure thought it was silly, that we ought to be able to approve our own out-of-state travel, but the way they did it, they said, okay, if you'll just give us that authority, we'll make the approval process to reside in the president's office. So here you have to go out of state. You had to get approval from the president's office. Well, that seems ridiculous today. But in any event, since I had a lot of in-state travel money, what I could use, I was quite willing to pay people's way to go to the state bar convention. Many of our faculty were on the program. And I really enjoyed getting to know a lot of these people. And I said this before, I said it at our banquet when we honored the People of the Lifetime Achievement Awards, that I just am really glad I got here and got to know people like Ralph Bilby and Evo DeConcini and Mary Ann Ritchie, Mo Udall, all these people that are passed on, and some who are obviously still with us. That I think was one of the things I enjoyed most. I also enjoyed seeing the school succeed and its graduates succeed. So I don't know. I mean, the highlights or what have you. I guess most of the satisfaction I got out of the job was seeing the school do well. Obviously, the new building was a big deal. I don't pretend to take credit for that. For one reason, a lot of the work had been done by Joe. And if you want to hear the story about how we got this building, it was because of a particular lawyer who was on the Board of Regents, and I suppose he wouldn't like me to say his name, but I will just because I think it's important. Tom Chandler was on the Board of Regents. We were under a show cause order of why we shouldn't be disaccredited because of our building. There's a lot of other politics and other things going on in the university, and the president of the university at that time was not too fond of lawyers, since he had about $7 million of civil rights suits pending against him. And Tom said he would have closed the law school if he could have gotten away with it. But as Tom also said, I told him, Tom speaking, that it'd make any difference. They'll come in from New Mexico and Colorado and California. There's an ample supply of lawyers in other states, and they'll still sue you. So it ain't gonna do any good to be mad at the law school because of this situation. But to make a long story short, the university had on its payroll at that time, through the extension division, a person named Tom Goodwin. And he happened to be chair of the Joint House-Senate Budget Committee, which is the most powerful committee up there. And essentially, Tom told the president of the university, Tom being on the Board of Regents, that he really wouldn't want to have the president's job unless we got a new law building. And the president, seeing the wisdom of such advice, basically went to Tom Goodwin and said, we got to have a new law building. And Tom Goodwin took the most important piece of legislation in the history of this state, probably, the groundwater bill, and stuck it in his pocket and said, this won't see the light of day until we have an appropriation for the new law building. And so that's a very shortened version of how we got the building. But that may look a little sordid or something, but it was also a different era. I mean, just because you had a meritorious case didn't mean that you were apt to get what you needed. There was a lot of politics involved. I had grown up in a state, that was Texas, where they played pretty rough in politics, and the same thing was going on up in Phoenix. And so that's just the way business was done. Just power politics, and we were in a position to extract this. It wasn't as if we didn't need the building and didn't deserve the building, but I'm not sure what would have happened if Tom hadn't been on the Board of Regents. We may eventually have gotten the building, but all things just fell into place, and that made a huge difference in the attitude of the faculty, the students, and the opportunity to do many, many things. For example, the trial practice program, and a lot of other things that we were unable to do when we were over in the so-called cream station.
Were there any surprises when you were dean?
Well, there are always surprises. You go down, it's like, I've always said being dean's a lot like practicing law. You go down to the office that day and you've got some project that you've been putting off and you need to work on, or you're in the middle of it and you're going back down here, and you get down to the office that day, and that isn't what you get to work on because something else comes up, some crisis. So it's those kind of surprises in the dean's office, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but you get blindsided by things that if you have time to think about them and prepare for them, and you know there's going to be some, contention or controversy, or people are not agreeing about something, you can plan for it. But the things that used to really get me were the things that you didn't know were coming. Something that somebody got mad at you about. Sometimes they were very trivial things and really, by hindsight, kind of silly. Other times they were things that were, frankly, put it in the vernacular, we had just screwed up. And we were wrong about something, or we had done something that we shouldn't have done. And sometimes you have to, as my old football coach at Texas, Darryl Roy, used to say, you have to eat a little humble pie and admit your mistakes, and it's not always easy. So, yeah, there was a few surprises.
Were there any special challenges because of the times when you were dean that was facing you either in the state or on a national basis?
Well, I became dean in 1977, and we were at the tail end of the Vietnam era, the so-called student unrest, student activism, whatever, however you want to describe it. The students in the law schools are far more, I think, rational about a lot of the things that concern them. And I found them, I don't think I ever really had a knockdown, drag out with any group of students. I'm sure there may have been a few students that didn't care for some of the positions I took, but as I told one student one time, sometimes you can't do everything you'd like to do, and you have to take it in steps. And it's not that I might disagree with you. I might agree with you, but I just don't feel like there's some things that I can accomplish overnight. But there was a real genuine concern, I think, among a lot of students about government in the United States, distrust in the government, things in society that they saw as injustices. Many of those students had come to law school because they thought law school was a path to change, and some of them, I think, ended up somewhat disappointed, found out how hard it really is to change things, whether you're a lawyer or not. But nonetheless, they were there, and they were idealistic, and I really enjoyed them. In fact, one of the students I enjoyed most was Suzanne Rebay, who I wouldn't say gave me trouble, but she certainly was not shy about pointing out things that maybe we hadn't been doing right. She had a genuine interest in minority students and increasing the enrollment, and at the time I thought she was right. But you don't just wave a magic wand and increase enrollment. It doesn't do a lot of good to bring in people who've not had an adequate education before they get here, throw them in with a bunch of people who have, and then flunk them all out. And so I was, probably going slower than some people would, but you had to build up, that pool of applicants. And we have, I think, crossed that bridge. Our minority applicants today are very highly qualified. It wasn't that the people that we got back in those days were not capable. A lot of them, they just came out of poor school systems. And it was not their fault. It's a problem I think we still have with Native Americans. They've not had the advantage of the educational systems that a lot of other people have. So it's not easy for them to succeed in some of these highly competitive environments that law school is. You look at the students we have now, and they're just, some of them are intimidating. They're really smart people.
Yeah, they are. In terms of students, were there any student organizations when you were dean?
Well, there are not as many as there are now. I know there were organizations like the Student Bar Association. At that time, the National Lawyers Guild was playing a large role in the law school. The Minority Law Student Association, I don't remember whether it's in existence when I got there, but it certainly came into existence if it wasn't. But that was probably about it. I mean, obviously you had the Law Review. Now we have two, the Journal of Environmental and International and Comparative Law. But other than that, I think there was the Law Women's Association. That was certainly around. I think Barbara Atwood, when she was a student here I guess she graduated about 1976. She was one of the original founders of that organization. Student organizations.
You mentioned a little bit of the relationship between the law school and the president's office here. Can you describe the relationship that you had with the rest of the university administration?
Well, John Schaefer was the president at that time, and a gentleman named Albert Weaver was the vice president for academic affairs, and then there was another fellow named Gary Munsinger who was vice president for business affairs. I didn't have that much contact with President Schaefer. He was interested more in larger issues. He didn't get so involved in everyday matters with the university, although there were some things he couldn't avoid. At that time, the president chaired the faculty senate meeting, and those were interesting meetings. assure you, having the president there and all the faculty able to take pot shots at the president. But I think Dr. Weaver, who was a physicist, his understanding of the nature of a law school, how it might not be quite the same as some area of the university, was not, let's say, perfect. I spent some time, trying to persuade him about certain things. One of the problems in the legal profession, unlike other disciplines, there were no awards. You don't give Nobel Prizes to lawyers and things like that, and like you do in chemistry or physics or stuff like that. And there are a number of other awards in those disciplines, and we just seemed to be a group of people that didn't stand out as far as he was concerned, although he certainly recognized legal talent, I think, when he saw it. But Gary Munsinger was probably the person that I was able to deal with the best. He had a brother who was a lawyer. He was also a member of the Faculty of Business Administration, and I think at one time was probably acting dean before he went into the main administration. But I had majored in business at the University of Texas, and I had been in a lot of the honor societies and whatever. And Texas had a very good business school, so I think we got off on the right foot. Plus, he liked Tom Chandler, and he thought Tom was a very interesting guy, and he is. But he also appreciated Tom. And I don't think that necessarily that John Schaefer, until later, that either John appreciated Tom's qualities or, in fact, Tom appreciated John's. And I think both of them today will tell you that they really weren't too nice to each other back in those days, and they should have been. But there were other people in the administration, Bob Swab, who was a dean of students, and David Windsor, who was another person who was in charge of admissions and a lot of other things administrative. We had a good relationship with them, good relationship with the university alumni office. The foundation, we didn't have a whole lot to do with because we had the Law College Association, and that was our fundraising arm, and I was content if they left me alone, I'd leave them alone. And that sort of, it worked out. It doesn't always work out because sometimes you might be wooing the same person in terms of a contribution and you can run into problems, but at least while I was dean, we had pretty good relations with the foundation. And the rest of the administration too. I think that during that 6-year period, once we got into the new building, and we were able to do a lot of things that brought recognition to the college and in turn brought recognition to the university, the law school was very much more appreciated. It was certainly true that the lawyers who were our alums that are on the Board of Regents made a great contribution in looking out for the University of Arizona and also helping, trying to raise funds through the legislature. So by the time I left, I think things had improved a lot, and that at least the president understood more that, we weren't turning out a group of people to make life miserable for him. They were just representing their clients. Henry Koffler came in my last year, and Henry is a very interesting man, and I really enjoyed him. And he had come from the University of Minnesota, and he really liked the law school. He was very proud that he had hired Bob Stein to be the dean up there. He told me repeatedly that sort of Bob was his person. Really with Henry, I think we got off to a fast start because he really appreciated what a good law school could be. And Minnesota has a very good law school. So.
What was the relationship like with ASU's law school at the time?
Well, that was interesting because I'm sure in your other interviews with Charles Ayers, that law school was opened by Willard Pedrick, who was on the Northwestern Law School faculty. And I don't think anyone did a better job of opening a new law school than Willard Pedrick. Willard was quite a person. I mean, he was just the most engaging guy you would ever want to meet, and he brought in 5 or 6 highly regarded faculty members from other universities. Ed Clary from Illinois, who was one of the outstanding evidence teachers and scholars in the United States. Dick Eflin from Wisconsin, a fellow named Haverhurst, and a couple other people, I think, who came from Northwestern. But in any event, so, that school got off to a great start, and immediately, just as there is in the athletic arena, there began to be a competition between the 2 schools. But I think that competition was and for the most part, it's been healthy. I've often said, and I really believe this, that the state is better off in having the 2 schools. We do a better job because of that competition, trying to outdo the other, than if you just had one big law school with the same number of students that the 2 law schools had. And when I got here, Pedrick had resigned as dean, and there was a fellow named Ernie Gellhorn who was, he'd been on the Virginia faculty. He had been with the Jones Day law firm. At that time, his offices were in Cleveland. And Ernie was a very bright, energetic, innovative person, and tough competition, let me tell you, in terms of him proselytizing our alumni up in Phoenix, and that's where the big law firms were, and going to them and saying, you're obviously going to be considering our graduates, and you want them, to be the best possible in terms of their legal education, and therefore you ought to support us. Well, that's a pretty good argument. So Ernie was making some substantial inroads with the big Phoenix firms, and he was doing a great job with his administration up there. And at that time, the ASU Law School was sort of their crown jewel. That was the college on that campus, and it had gotten off to such a good start, it had a national reputation. And they didn't mind telling everybody that, they were the national law school and stuff. Frankly, I don't think they're any better than this law school, but, some people thought they were. Mm-hmm. But Ernie eventually left and went on to the University of Washington, and then back into practice. I would say the competition between the 2 schools was pretty fierce when Ernie was there, but then Alan Matheson became the dean, and Alan and I were good friends, and I think there was more of a cooperative spirit since that time, and we've had good relations. But even when we were sort of going head to head trying to raise money and stealing each other's students and whatever it was we were trying to do to each other to outdo the other one. Once we got the new building, things seemed to go very well for us, and I'm not going to, venture any opinions about which school is better, but obviously my loyalties lie with this one.
Well stated. Tell us a little bit about the new building. It's the building that we're in right now,
That's
correct?
Right.
I understand you came in under budget. I'm very impressed in that you were able to add some things to the building.
Well, it is, again, a different era. It was an interesting process. Once the legislature appropriated the money, what they did was they had planned, they didn't appropriate all the money at one time to build the building completely. And what they thought they would do is the building would be built in stages. Well, they appropriated, and I've forgotten now the exact details, but let's just say $4 million, and that was obviously enough to get the building going, and then there would have to be more money to complete the building. At that time, M.M. Sunt, S-U-N-D-T, was and is a big international construction company. It just so happened they were interested in having some type of a public works project in Tucson. They were not too busy, and they came in with a bid which astounded us because according to their bid, they could build the whole building essentially for that $4 million. So we then went back to the legislature and said, look, we've got an opportunity here to do something, but we need to have an understanding. This is just the building, that we can get the whole thing for $4 million, but that means we're going to have to come back to you for equipment, because the way buildings were funded in those days, for example, if they appropriated $10 million for a building, a percentage of that was to go for equipment and furnishings. Well, obviously we were going to end up with a building with no opportunity to buy the equipment. So this is where a person like Gary Munsinger came in very handy, because he was able to go up there to the legislature and deal with the budget committee, and he basically cut a deal with them and said, okay, if you'll change the appropriation authorization so that we can spend this entire $4 million to build the building, we will not come back to you for one penny. We will do it somehow or some way. We will do it. And if it turns out to be cost overrun, that's our problem. But we get to come back and ask for equipment. And they said, fine. Probably wasn't going to cost them much more anyway, if anything, to do it that way. So we did. And but part of the deal was on my part was I had to keep change orders to an absolute minimum, and as the building was being built, certain things appeared that probably we would, well, not probably, we would have liked to have changed, but I didn't dare do it. So we built the building, and then we got to put together an equipment list and go back to the legislature, and we got almost $1 million for equipment. Now, in that equipment list were, once you put one together, everybody in the university, including physical resources, building and grounds, all of a sudden they need 10 new riding lawnmowers, and you don't have any grass over here, or very little grass. That thing was, they snuck a lot of stuff in there. We didn't get $1 million, but we got all new furnishings for the building, which made a big difference. Then I later learned that maybe some of the money that didn't actually end up in our pocket went to remodel the press box over at the football stadium, but that's the way it goes. You give a little, you get a little. You make these deals and, whine about things, and you get out of it what you want, and maybe somebody else gets a little something. But,
The last year that you were dean, the entering class was 45% women. Was that a big change from the past?
Well, the change actually started, and I remember this specifically, in the early 70s, which is, of course, before I came here. I think someone overnight sent out the word to women in this country, hey, you want to go to law school? Because all of a sudden, in the early 70s, we began to get, and I was at Nebraska at the time, many, many more applications from women. And part of that was as a result of the movement among students in general about change and what have you, and also part of the women's liberation movement. And also, the law schools quit discriminating against women. And there was no question about it. When I was in law school, and I started law school in 1962 at the University of Texas, I don't remember now exactly how many people were in my entering class, but there was at least 250 and maybe 300. I just don't remember the exact figure. But I can tell you the names of all 3 women in that class. And all 3 of them came from families with lawyers. One of them was Macy Hodges. Her father was on the faculty at the law school. Another one was a woman named Sherry Perkins, and her father was a lawyer in Mount Vernon, Texas. And another one was Barbara Kazin, who came from a prominent political family in Laredo. That was it. Women just didn't go to law school, and it was sort of a, self-fulfilling prophecy. So therefore they didn't apply. And one of the arguments that was used in those days was that, well, women are not going to practice law, they're going to get married, they're going to have families, so it really is not a good use of state resources. But really, beneath that was an attitude that was rock bottom. Women are not cut out to be lawyers. Well, when women start to think, gee, there's something better in life than teaching 7th grade English, or maybe, whatever they majored in undergraduate school, the job market might not have been too great. Plus, just all of the social upheaval in this country generating, out of the Vietnam era, the civil rights movement, women's horizons were certainly expanded. And I would like to take a little bit of credit, not a whole lot, I think, but it was really my generation. I had been in teaching about 3 years when the admissions process at Nebraska was run by the dean. And we, in a faculty meeting, some younger faculty members, we took that away from him and set up a committee because we thought that there ought to be, some other process. And once you opened up the admissions process and said anybody who wants to can apply and be considered on the merits, bingo, overnight. I mean, women had always been qualified in terms of their academic achievements. Law wasn't the only place they were discriminated against. I majored in accounting. The top 10 people in my class at the University of Texas Business School in accounting, at least 5 of them were women. Maybe more, but at least 5 of them, because I can remember. The top person was a woman named Joanne Rabb. And she was so good that when I was taking advanced accounting, she was not only taking the class, she was grading it because it was in the spring and there wasn't any seniors around to do this, so the professor hired a member of our class to grade the class, and that was a little interesting situation. But anyway, they couldn't get jobs with the major accounting firms. Why? Well, how can you send women out on an audit? I mean, as if they were going to have to share a room with the male audit. I mean, you can't have 2 rooms in a hotel. I mean, one for your... Anyway, clear discrimination in the accounting. Once that was removed, almost overnight, the enrollments went from practically nothing, like in my class at the University of Texas, to almost half. So I came here in 1977. So that was well underway, and I certainly take no credit for that here. It was a national thing. Some schools lagged behind, but the state law schools generally. So today you have, half the enrollment are women. It was, I think, a very good thing. Very good thing for legal education. Very good thing for profession. It took a long time for those women to percolate up to positions of power, judgeships. We're still not 50-50 in the academic world, but we're getting close. And I don't think today anybody even thinks about it anymore. When you're looking at resumes of faculty candidates, it just doesn't enter my mind to think about this person as a man or a woman or what have you. And there are outstanding candidates. And I think they're pretty much, in fact, I think I can say without equivocation that people are judged on the merits. It does not make any difference anymore. I wouldn't say that is entirely true in practice. There's still some of the old guard out there. You look at the law firms, you can just tell by looking at the makeup of them. Not maybe that many women in the firm, but there isn't any question that women out there are as good as the men, and a lot of times better. Very, very able lawyers and judges. So.
Which of the faculty members that are still here were hired by you when you were dean?
Well, Tom Malway was one. Mark Asher, who just left, was another. And of course, we were sorry to see them leave. I guess, gosh, I'd have to go around the hall here and think about people. Barbara Atwood was a visiting professor here, but I don't think she was hired until Paul Marcus I think she was hired during Paul Marcus's reign as dean. Just very quickly started thinking through. Right offhand, I can't really, I'm not sure there is anyone else. There may be, a lot of people, for example, on the staff, like Henrietta Stover. she was hired while I was dean. Sissy Armstrong was well, she was already here, Sissy, when I got here. But, people like Kenny Hagelin, Andy Silverman, who had been on the faculty in the clinical program. So even though he was hired back when I was dean, it was not a new hire. But you had people like David Wexler, Art Andrews, Bill Boyd, Woody, Roy Spees was already on the faculty. A number of those people that we hired went on to other law schools. And of course, that's been a problem, and always will be a problem until you sort of break the sound barrier and you're able to pay people and provide them with the other types of support that these major law schools can provide. So trying to keep people here is, I think, going to be one of Tony's challenges.
Yeah.